Thank you very much, and thank you hugely to the organisers. I've really enjoyed every talk that's come up, and it's been so, I think, as Monique said, it's been so fantastic to hear the advances that have been made in research here and in mainland China. I'm going to change the direction a little bit and talk about clinical trials. We've been doing clinical trials since 1995 in Chinese medicine. And of course, there are major problems in trying to get that information translated into practice, to try and validate the way in which people are practicing and the medicines themselves. And as we've heard from some of the speakers, the actual quality control is a critical issue. So whilst we started with clinical trials back in 1995, we then had to go backwards and backfill and set up some quality control laboratories that we now have very well established in order to ensure that our material is well monitored from the beginning of the trial all the way through to the end. And so it's quite a complex process of ensuring that. And we've also carried on with some pharmacological research. So the first thing, I suppose, is just reminding ourselves of the purpose of clinical trials. This is an Australian cartoonist who says, before we think about surgical removal, we'll try putting you on chamomile tea for a few weeks and see what happens. Well, you know, the truth is about 60 or 70% of our medical interventions are not well validated. And so this is not an unusual perspective. And of course, it's an even more common perspective around anything to do with complementary medicine or Chinese medicine. So the idea is that we undertake clinical trials to build evidence that actually guides public policy. And by that, I mean it actually guides the funding. We've heard today, or you've known for a long time, that Hong Kong's developing a TCM hospital. This takes money, it takes an investment, it takes a policy decision, and that policy decision has to be based on some kind of evidence, and that's what this is about. Doing the clinical trials is that final step, really, in ensuring that what we're spending our money on actually works. And billions of dollars are spent each year on trials. And the critical thing is that we have to match the trial design, which is quite detailed, to actually address the clinical question and to suit the intervention. And that's what I hope to just go through, some of our experiences in the last 20 years trying to do that. Many of you are aware of the kinds of clinical trials that exist. There are very tightly controlled trials where you test the efficacy of a very specific medicine. There are trials where you allow a more free hand, what we call a pragmatic clinical trial or an open label trial, where you try and reflect what actually goes on in clinical practice rather than giving some patients a placebo and then all patients know that they might be getting a placebo, therefore they don't feel as comfortable during the trial. And there are also cohort studies and case control studies where you actually monitor prospectively or retrospectively the differences between patients that have been receiving treatments and those that haven't. So ultimately, choosing any of those trial designs, and there are many others, many permutations on them, we have to match that design with the actual question. So there's a few examples there. What's the relative efficacy of Chinese herbal medicine for a specific disease? Well, you'd usually set up a randomized controlled trial that's blinded, and you use either an active or a placebo as the control. If you're looking at side effects from Chinese herbal medicine, then you might actually do observational studies or longitudinal surveys, etc. So all of these questions have to be addressed right up front when you're actually planning your study. What are you trying to actually achieve? Are you trying to impact on policy? Are you trying to achieve a commercial outcome for an industry sponsor? They're all very different questions. And most of you will be familiar with the different phases of clinical trials that we undergo, from the early testing to make sure that we understand how the drug works in the body and to get the dosage right at least, to an awareness of the minimisation of risk in the phase 1 and even phase 2, where you're still establishing a dose sometimes. and then into phase 3, which is the final phase. Those numbers, those sample sizes are a little bit big. I've sat on the TGA evaluation committee for all sorts of complementary medicines, including Chinese medicines that come up for evaluation, and in many cases a phase 3 trial might only be 300 or 500 patients, so it doesn't necessarily end up being that large for a high-level claim. So there are all these designs, and of course the question is, well, you know, do we need to do the research? And as we've heard, and in fact I think I'm even understating the figures here of 172 billion, as we've heard, this is a huge area of growth. It's a big area of growth outside of China as well. And in Australia, I'll jump a slide ahead. In Australia, we have 3 in 4 of our consumers using some form of complementary medicine, and Chinese medicine is the fastest growing. It's the fastest growing medicine in Australia. We, like China, like a large part of Europe and America, have an aging population with an increased prevalence of chronic disease. So there's a shift, a consciousness to try and shift the burden, the cost of disease management away from the public system, away from public hospitals, and to get people to take more private ownership of their care. There's good and bad aspects to that, but what is good about it is that disease prevention is really emphasised very strongly, and I think Chinese medicine can play a very strong part in that, a very major part in that. So going back to the growth, you can see here that the top line is the total, and the yellow line is Asia total, the red line USA. What you're seeing is a constant growth in all corners of the world in Chinese medicine. I'm sure most of you are aware of that, but of course that puts a burden on us as well, on us in the West, to actually ensure that it's used safely, as Monique had said, and ensure we've got the right quality, but also ensure that it's used effectively. In the last year or so, we've had so much interest from public hospitals in Sydney, where I work, to actually develop and facilitate integrative medicine services. It's come particularly from those areas in Sydney where there's a big Chinese population, and particularly in the field of oncology. The oncologists there have to deal with 9 in 10 of their patients using herbal medicine as part of their treatment, and they don't know what to do because they're administering other things, radiotherapy, chemotherapy at the same time. So they're actually wanting better direction and guidance without actually being dismissive of the patient. So we have a particular urgency in Australia to get the evidence argument right and to get the safety right. I'll come back and talk about this later, but one of the fabulous things that's happened in the last couple of years is that we're the first Western country to actually recognise Chinese medicine practice. So all practitioners of Chinese medicine now in Australia are registered, just like doctors, just like nurses, physiotherapists. They have the same legal structure and system for Chinese medicine practitioners now. This is a fabulous move because it allows better integration, but it's a high-risk move. It's high risk because if anything untoward happens, then they're more exposed. The quality of the herbs is not controlled by the TGA. The quality of the herbs is actually, the responsibility of the quality lies with the practitioner. It seems absurd, but that's the situation at the moment. The TGA, our regulators, only control the prepared medicines. So all the raw herbs, all the extracts, it's the responsibility of the practitioner. So we need to turn to all our good colleagues that work in this area to make sure that we're actually getting good quality product, so that where a Western country has stuck its head out and recognised and regulated Chinese medicine practice, that we get the support from China and colleagues overseas to ensure that we're doing it as best we can. That was a little diversion, my apologies. So I'm going to come back a little bit more to speaking specifically about the trials. This chart just gives you a very basic idea of the increase in the number of clinical trials that have been done. Just to give a snapshot, so we looked at PubMed, which is the red line, and looked at OneFung database, which is the blue line. And on the left-hand side, you have the scale of the OneFung database. You can see that in the last few years, there's been 2,500 trials undertaken, which is a huge number of clinical trials. The main filter for this was clinical trials, so it didn't distinguish between types of clinical trials. In the PubMed, you take the right-hand axis, the right-hand vertical axis, and you're really talking about 140 or so clinical trials a year in recent years. When you break that down a little bit further into controlled clinical trials or randomized clinical trials, the randomized clinical trials is the green line, the controlled clinical trials is the red line. You can see in the OneFung database, the Chinese database, that there's a greater separation. There are fewer randomized or controlled clinical trials than there are generally the classification of clinical trials, which might be a reflection of the way in which the trials are performed, not as tightly or as rigorously as maybe they should be, but we'll come to that. When you look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses, the meta-analyses here are in green and the systematic reviews are in blue. And you can see that in PubMed, there's a large number of systematic reviews. They're growing strongly, which is fabulous, because this is, in terms of the hierarchy of evidence, this is quite an important way of achieving conclusions. But in the OneFung database, most of them seem to be meta-analyses. If this is true, then this is actually a very good thing, because meta-analyses are much more rigorous. But the problem is with nomenclature. Have we got the nomenclature right in identifying these studies? Just a quick scan of the clinical areas as well. You've got two columns there, the number of trials, clinical trials, and the number of systematic reviews. It's often quite nice to get a quick sense of how many trials are happening in a particular clinical area, and also how many systematic reviews or meta-analyses have happened, because it gives you a sense of whether the review of evidence is keeping up with the volume of clinical trials. There have been cases where you might have 100 clinical trials and just no systematic reviews in that space. I'm coming back to this slide because there's one thing I want to point out. You probably noticed that, in fact, the number of trials in the last few years, if you look between 2009 and 2014, there's a downward dip. And you have to ask, why is there a decline in clinical trials? And I don't have a clean answer to that. I mean, one might say, oh, look, maybe there's a bit of a delay. It was the global financial crisis and people didn't put as much money into clinical trials. But I actually suspect that it's a bit more complex than that. I've been watching trials for the last 20 years or so, and to what extent they influence policy. And I think, as most of you probably have the sense of as well, many clinical trials and many systematic reviews criticise the quality of clinical trials. And there are some very consistent problems with the clinical trials. And as soon as that happens, there inevitably arises the question of, what's the point? What's the point in doing the trial if it doesn't actually change behaviour, if it doesn't actually change policy? And so I suspect that there may be an element of that that's been happening in the last 3, 4, 5 years as well, that people are getting a bit uncertain about the value of the trial in terms of changing behaviour, and maybe even achieving a commercial outcome for an industry group. So what are the levels of evidence that we need? And this comes from the Oxford University evidence-based website, so it's easy, it's a universal source. This is what every government agency uses to determine whether there's strong enough evidence to change practice, or even whether there's strong enough evidence to fund a drug or fund, an intervention. And the first 3 lines there, 1A, 1B, 1C, are the top levels of evidence that are required. Systematic reviews with homogeneity of randomised controlled trials. Interestingly enough, what most people don't realise is that level 1 evidence is also one very good trial with narrow confidence intervals. And then there's an all or none principle, which is basically if all patients died before a treatment and then you introduce the treatment and some survive, then that's also high-level evidence. So any of those A, B, C are considered high-level evidence, and they will affect policy. They will change policy. Most of our clinical trials in Chinese medicine on their own sit at level 2B. They're generally moderate quality randomized controlled trials. This is what most of the systematic reviews say. If you go to the Cochrane, if you go to any systematic reviews, not even Cochrane, they say generally things like randomization was unclear, blinding was inadequate, outcome measures were poorly defined, statistics needed strengthening, and there was a potential for publication bias because mostly you just see good trials, positive outcome trials published and not the negative outcome trials. So these are the problems that have been recognised in Chinese herbal medicine trials that we need to address. And as a community, you know, in medicine and healthcare, we're aware of the need to try and capture the right information in how we report clinical trials. So the Consort Criteria for reporting clinical trials gives you a guidance for how to report the flow of participants, what details to report in each of the sections. And the Consort took it even further. They actually went and developed, a subgroup developed what should be relevant also for reporting of information in herbal medicine clinical trials, including details about the product, the characteristics, as in the qualitative characteristics, its chemical characteristics, the dosage regimen, etc. And even the practitioner, the skill base of the practitioner. So we're getting a bit more reporting, which will help a clearer evaluation of the trial, of the trials that are used in a systematic review. But is that enough? Is it enough just to report what was done in the trial? And what is peculiar about Chinese medicine? One of the most particular things about Chinese medicine is that it offers a personalised approach, as you all know. There are different formulae for different classifications of the same disease. Somebody comes in with a Western diagnosis, it can be diagnosed in different directions and treated differently. And the tailoring of the formula, the tailoring of the prescription to that patient's subtype may be important at the beginning, but it may also be important as the patient progresses through the various recovery or disease phases. So here's a really critical problem and a decision that has to be made right at the beginning. When you do a clinical trial in Chinese medicine, are you going to evaluate one fixed product and just identify a cohort of patients for whom everyone gets that? If you are commissioned by industry, that's all they'll want you to do because they just want that one fixed product proven. But if you're trying to support the new hospital and the practitioners in the new hospital and the concept of treating individual patients, then you need to have something broader than that. You need to show that tailoring actually does make a difference and people aren't wasting their time. And you know, it's not an unusual concept. Pharmacogenomics, N-of-1 studies, they're all things that recognise the individual constitution of the patient and the ability to address medicines that are more personalised and create medicines that are more personalised. So there are difficulties in designing trials that try to accommodate this tailored treatment process. And as we've said before, the chemical definition of these complex medicines and stability, demonstrating stability throughout the trial is important. So all of those are really critical challenges that we need to deal with. Okay, tailoring treatments. I went back to PubMed and Wanfeng database and had a look at how many trials actually do individualization. In PubMed, you can see it's a very funny curve there. It's actually just 1 or 2 trials each year, hardly anything at all. It's a very unusual type of trial to report. In the Wanfeng database, there are as many as 100 or 200 there that have been happening in recent years. So clearly there's a much greater consciousness in Chinese medicine researchers' minds about the need to tailor treatment, which is a good thing. I'm just going to describe 2 trials that we did that tried to address this some time ago, very, very briefly. One of them was published in 1998, a long time ago. It was where we actually set up complete tailoring of treatment. So we actually had 80, 90 herbs ready that we were going to use in a cohort of IBS patients, and we set it up so that it was completely blinded. We had 3 treatment groups. One was a placebo group, one was a standardized formulation that had been developed, and the other was an individualized treatment that was changed at every consultation that the patient came in. It was completely blinded. It's hard to believe. I won't go into lots of details now, but fundamentally, a patient would come in, see a practitioner, the practitioner would write the prescription would go to an outside research assistant who would take it to a dispensary which would be closed and separate, and no one would know what medicine came back, but in the dispensary they had the randomization schedule and knew what to do. And every patient had to wait the same amount of time, so we created all these walls so that you couldn't tell what was going on. In brief, what it actually showed is that after the intervention period of 4 months, both the active and standard treatment groups, the individualized and standard treatment groups responded well. In actual fact, surprisingly, those on the standard medication responded better than those on the tailored medication. But then we followed them up. We followed them up 3 months later. And you can see there on the right-hand side of that top curve, the pink line comes back up towards the blue line, which is the placebo. And the line that stays low is that dark line, which is the individual treatments. So at follow-up, when we went back to patients, it was those that were treated with the tailored treatment that had better long-term outcomes. So the short-term outcomes were more or less similar, but the standard group improved slightly better, but the long-term outcomes were better in the tailored treatment. A colleague of mine also did this sort of work in primary dysmenorrhea, but this time, instead of tailoring every treatment to every patient, which, by the way, I would probably never do again in my life because it was just so much work, she actually took half a dozen different subcategories of primary dysmenorrhea and classified the patients into one of those half a dozen categories, and then each one of those diagnostic categories received a different treatment. And interestingly enough, the same sort of things were noticed, that in actual fact, at follow-up, those patients receiving individualized treatment, their effect was sustained and strengthened. So they continued to improve after treatment stopped. But at the end of the actual 3 months treatment, the patients on standard treatment actually did slightly better than those that were tailored. So we've noticed this in 2 trials already, and it'd be very interesting to see these sorts of processes in other trials. So how might we best test Chinese medicine? This was the question I was just asking a while ago. Do we do a randomized control of one fixed intervention, or do we try and tailor the intervention to individual diagnoses and tailor it as the patient's condition changes? We've done a recent scan of Chinese herbal medicine for pre-diabetes. There are 100 different trials that we looked at, different formulations. Only 13 of those trials use the same formulation. So this is one of the problems we have as well in building up our evidence. These are the herbs that appear in 10% of the trials. So you can think of how many other herbs there are that are even less common than these. And the most common ones were, of course, Huangqi and Shanyao and Huanglian at the bottom. So the question, the trouble that this poses is how, when you've got a policy decision-making body that wants to know, okay, we believe you, Chinese herbal medicine is good for pre-diabetes. Which Chinese medicine? What do we use? This is where the problem is. How do we advise? Which one of those 100 formulas do we choose? Which one of those trials do we choose? And these are exactly the sort of questions that I'm being asked by industry, who want to help develop this, by the hospitals, who want to know what to use. And of course, it's what you guys are faced with every day as well. So I think one of the things that's really important is that there needs to be some filtering and some process of trying to align the right formulas for the right cohorts as we go forward. Now, I'm going to raise one other problem that I think is a really major problem in clinical trials in general. The Consort Criteria I just described before, it stands for the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials. What's really important is that these criteria are only about reporting. They're not about doing. So when you see a systematic review that uses the Consort, you think, oh, that's good. They use the Consort Criteria, that, so they're thoroughly investigating the trials. They're not investigating the quality of the trials. They're actually just investigating the quality of the reporting in the paper. It's a really big difference. There are lots of things that are not clear in trials that aren't reported. So what I'm saying is it does not give you an assessment of the true quality of the trial. It just gives you a tick box of things that they've reported. And here's an example that I think is really important. In 1999, in JAMA, there was a meta-analysis performed of 17 different trials that were comparing 2 different forms of heparin for the prevention of post-operative thrombosis. And they applied, just for fun, 25 different clinical trial rating scales. And this is what came out. Now, on the left-hand side, you've got all the clinical rating scales. Clinical rating scales are scales that you can use to determine how well a trial is actually performed. Not reported, but how it's performed. Does the blinding, is it adequate? Is there withdrawal of patients? Is there good randomization? Many other items. If you just take the top line, poignard, there are 14 items in that group, that person's rating scale, and some of them include randomization, blinding, withdrawal, and there are 11 other aspects or items that are measured. If you go down halfway down that table, you'll see Jadad et al. 1996. I'm sorry, I can't. There we go. Jadad et al. 1996. 3 items. Most of the weighting is on randomization and on blinding and on withdrawal. Now, the interesting thing about this meta-analysis is that the score on the right-hand side here tells you whether the new heparin works better than the old heparin. For the government to make a decision on whether the new heparin works better than the old heparin, you've got to have at least a score of 50%. If this meta-analysis used any of those top few rating scales, they would have proven that the new heparin is worse than the old heparin. If they used other scales, they would have proven the new heparin is better than the old heparin. This is what is happening all the time with systematic reviews. So here's the outcome. For this particular study in JAMA, for 6 scales, the high-quality studies, those studies that were classified as really good quality studies, showed that the old heparin was better than the new, and that low-quality trials showed the opposite. In this same study, they demonstrated that for 7 of the rating scales, high-quality trials showed that the new heparin was better than the old, the complete opposite. This is level 1 evidence. This is what, we look at systematic reviews in the Cochrane, and so often it says that the consistent criticism is that often best trials are reported as having negative outcomes. Well, who's determining what are the best trials? Where are the rating scales that determine good Chinese medicine trials? We've just seen 25 rating scales applied to a medical intervention, and those 25 scales, according to which scale you chose, you would have got a completely different policy decision. So this is a really critical problem that we're not dealing with in Chinese medicine yet. The systematic review conclusions depend on how we analyse the trials, the scales we use to assess the trials. So different rating scales lead to different outcomes, and this is really important. There is not, at the moment, a rating scale that evaluates the quality of a Chinese medicine trial. Here's one of the most common scales that's been used in the systematic reviews in the Cochrane. It's the Jadad scale. This is what it does. Randomization, 1 point. The techniques described, 1 point. The blinding, 1 point. The evaluator blinded, 1 point. Description of withdrawals and dropouts, 1 point. 5 out of 5, good trial. You could read many trials and they could be very good because they've done all that. Or maybe you could read an individualized, tailored trial in Chinese medicine that's very good but didn't do the blinding of the evaluator, and you think it's a rubbish trial. But in actual fact, it might be a much better trial. So what we've got is people judging the quality of Chinese herbal medicine trials without having the right focus, without having the right lens through which to judge it. Do you follow what I'm saying? It's really important that we do the proper assessment of Chinese medicine trials. No one can lead this but the people in this room. No one else can do it. This is something that we have to do. If we leave it to methodologists, you'll end up with the Jadad scale being used time and time again, and similar scales like this, and you'll end up with the conclusion that good trials, methodologically good trials, don't give you good results. So all we need is an internationally agreed, peer-reviewed clinical rating scale for the evaluation of Chinese herbal trials. We've started to do this in acupuncture, and we've included things like the points, how they're selected, the diagnosis, how it's made, the type of treatment, the depth of insertion, manipulation, number of treatments, all these things that influence the acupuncture outcome. And I was very motivated to do this a long, long time ago because in the Australian Medical Journal of Australia, some years ago, they published a trial of the use of acupuncture for asthma, and they showed that it wasn't any good. And I looked at, and it looked like a very good trial because they had a control group and all of this, and I looked at the acupuncture points that were used in the control group, and I thought, they could be used in the real group. They're actually very good points for asthma too. I thought, who designed this trial? And so there are all these problems that actually happen in trials, but yet it was classified as a very high quality trial. So I think we have to be very careful about what we regard as high quality trials, and we take control over that, and we take control over the systematic reviews that make those evaluations. And of course, the important thing is that we've got to, which is hard, this isn't easy, getting consensus. We've got to get consensus on the weighting of these factors. How important is it to do the diagnosis? We've got to make a decision, and do we weigh that very heavily or not when we create a rating scale? How important is it relative to other factors? I'm sorry if this is getting a little bit methodological, but they're the sort of things that we have to do. Okay, so we decide we're going to do a good trial. We try and set it up as well as we can. We anticipate the policy decisions and evidence that we want to try and accumulate. We design it well. We decide where to go. Well, this is a bit of a quick scan of the global costs of clinical trials. It looks like we may want to all go to Mexico to get it done because that's where they're the cheapest at the moment. Most of the trials have got very similar costs across most countries. Probably Europe and Japan and the US are at the right-hand side there. They're probably the more expensive places to go. But they are, as I said right at the beginning, they are critical things to do to actually get the evidence right. You know, when we did the review for government around the regulation of practice of Chinese medicine in Australia, one of the things we had to do was look at the evidence, and that wasn't used a lot because the main reason for regulation in Australia is to protect the public, to ensure that education and practice are strong enough. But there was a large body of clinical evidence, and we've pursued that as well. These are some of the trials that we've done. It's not an exhaustive list, but some of the clinical trials we've done in the last 15 years or so in our National Institute. And many of them, you know, they're not a 2-week laboratory test. These things take 2 or 3 years sometimes. We're just about to embark on a trial of a medicine for vascular dementia for which there is no pharmaceutical. It's a 3-herb medicine, and that is going to take us about 3 to 4 years. It's a 1-year intervention period. So these are long trials, difficult to set up. It's multi-centre and you know, a lot of patients. But they're very rewarding if they're well designed and well structured. If any of you are interested, we actually have developed standard operating procedures for clinical trials in Chinese medicine. They are available on our website. They comply with ICH guidelines. We actually set up trials so that our data capture is compliant with FDA audits if required. And we're very happy to send copies of these if people want them as well. I think, again, it just helps to ensure that the quality of the trials are strong. One of the things I mentioned right at the beginning is that Australia has actually introduced regulation of Chinese medicine practitioners. It is a very important step because, on the one hand, it allows us to integrate with other medical practitioners. We've already got one of our postdocs working in one of the largest hospitals in Sydney, in one of the cancer facilities, administering acupuncture, and within a few months I'm sure we'll have it in a number of the different hospitals. One of the big challenges in Australia has been getting the herbs in there as well, and we're in discussion to actually do that and ensure that we've got the right quality controls. And so I think it's a fabulous move because it's really the sharp end, I suppose, of trying to develop this sort of intervention in a Western environment. And as you can well imagine, and I think Monique signalled that as well, in the West there's always a degree of scepticism and criticism about any form of non-conventional medicine. And so we have to deal with that very carefully as we go forward. But this will certainly help the case. So for us, it's really about scaling up. We have a situation where Australia, the government has stepped out and recognised Chinese medicine practitioners. We need to make sure that we back that up so that in 5 years' time we don't find ourselves in a situation where we still are the only Western country that has done it nationally, and potentially that we have some adverse events or something, and then there's a bit of a withdrawal that the government might make. So we have to make sure that Chinese medicine is also regulated, the practice is also regulated in other countries nationally, such as Canada or other Western countries in Europe, so that we can actually get cohesion between the different entities. I'm just going to very briefly mention that we have an extraordinary opportunity at the University of Western Sydney. We have a medical school there. For you in Hong Kong, it's very common for you to have a medical school and a Chinese medical program together. In Australia, we're the only ones. I don't know of another one in North America or in Europe that has both Chinese medicine and Western medicine taught in the same university. We have an extremely supportive Dean and Vice-Chancellor, and we're actually planning the development of a new Chinese medicine R&D platform, a significant scale-up. We currently have 50 to 55 staff. We do preclinical work, the herbal analysis, all the way through to clinical trials and policy work, and the idea now is that we want to move a lot of that forward into a strongly integrated platform with the local hospitals. And I think that's probably all I want to say at this stage, just that we're hoping that we'll be able to work more closely with our colleagues in Hong Kong. It's always a delight to come up here and talk to friends again and to hear the latest research that's happening. And I'll leave you with this building, which is our aspirational building. I hope next time I talk to you, I'll say that we're established in every corner of this building. It's right next to Westmead Hospital, which is the largest medical precinct in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is where our Vice-Chancellor wants to see us as well. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to tell a good story at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bensoussan.